because sometimes I get lulled into this false sense that these kids that are in my class that are in special ed, like, they're actually doing awesome. Like, they're doing so well. We have gotten through more curriculum this year than I have ever gotten through before. And then I'm like, oh, but eye on the prize. I've got to keep moving them. I can't be lulled into this false sense that everything is going awesome and not keep boosting, keep pushing. So that keeps us a little bit grounded in what we know about where their peers are and where we're sort of shooting for, setting our aims really high, okay? So keep thinking about that. For progress monitoring, that is interesting. So I talked at the last session, I always said, and the research that we've done, early on in CBM, the research that was done, we always said progress monitor at instructional level. Okay, wherever the student's at, we determine that. We use little criteria, like here are little criteria, if they do math and they have a mean score that is less than 10 digits, move down a grade level. If it's between 10 and 15, there's these guidelines that you can use. Here's one, here's one for reading. If they're reading less than 10 correct words, move down. If it's between 10 and 50, So we have these guidelines. There are certain programs, for instance, like AimsWeb, that say progress monitor at grade level unless the student is 2 or more grade levels off. And so I've got myself into a lot of trouble because I was like, it's always an instructional level, and then they were like, administrators in this district were like, well, the AimsWeb says this, so you do have to follow the guidelines for the system you're using. But the tough thing is, for a lot of the kids that you all help support and that you all work with, and especially like as we get in, how many of you work with teachers and students up into middle and high school? Yeah, as we get up into middle and high school, I'd love to say that we're closing the gap, but unfortunately sometimes that gap gets even a little larger. So I've got 32 undergrads right now that are out in middle and high school settings, and they're doing CBM projects. Can you imagine? I make them do CBM projects. And they've got kids, sophomores reading at a 2nd grade level, juniors reading at a 5th grade level, so I mean it's all over the place. Well, we have to start thinking about again then, how do I get data that's most important to inform my instruction, and should it be, at grade level, should it be at an instructional level? A bigger question that a woman in my previous session raised was, what kinds of measures do we use for those middle and high school students? Do you have questions about that? What do we use for those upper grade kids? For screening, there are measures, CBM measures, that go up through 8th grade now. We actually use the 8th grade measures to screen all of the freshmen in these 3 high schools in this first ring suburb of St. Louis, Hazelwood, Missouri. So they've got, 1,500 kids or so in each high school. So they use Maze. They only use Maze. So they group administered. The hardest thing was the scoring and entry of data. I don't know that that's necessary. There was another woman I was talking to, and they're using SRI and SMI for screening for all of their high school students 3 times a year. I think when we get up into those upper grades, it's not that I don't think screening's important, but I think that we want to see if we can reduce the number of kids. We've got enough history now on these kids. Can we reduce the number of kids that we have to screen? So could we use 8th grade ISTEP to make like the first cut, So we say in the fall, those kids who scored, I don't know how they're scored. Like in Missouri, it's like, if they're proficient or advanced, then they pass. If they're basic or below basic, then they didn't pass. So can we pick the kids that didn't pass ISTEP? Can we give them screening measures, either SRI or whatever, or in our case we used 8th grade AIMSweb to do kind of a second round to put them into intervention groups. For progress monitoring, of course, you can use out of grade level measures, and so for our students that are sophomores reading at 5th grade level, it's absolutely great and fantastic to progress monitor them at their instructional level, and we should be doing that, and that's super powerful for those kids at the secondary level. I think people get caught up in like, I'm looking for 9 through 12, it's not on here. Forgetting that once they're in high school, a lot of our kids that are significantly struggling, they're way off grade level. Like, I don't need 12th grade progress monitoring measures because these kids are reading at a 4th grade level. I'm going to go back and pull my 4th grade progress monitoring tools. So it's really powerful. Hard, in my experience, hard to get teachers to do that, to progress monitor. But I hope more of you have been successful. Have any of you been successful at supporting teachers at the high school level to do some progress monitoring? Yeah. How'd you do it? Did you pay them? Yeah. Yeah.
But we have been exploring the use of the RAP4 progress monitoring version, and of course you can do it 3 times, 4 times a year, so it seems more like it's benchmark.
Yeah. But it's getting closer, at least. Yeah, that's good.
If you had an opinion or familiarity with that.
I don't with that tool. The RAP4, did you say? Yeah, I don't know about that. Does anybody else? RAP4 for progress monitoring? Anybody else? Yeah, no, I don't know about that.
And I think it's the difference, at least for us, as we change from our familiarity with the elementary levels, is that they do level equivalency.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's a completely different system of looking at the progress of growth value.
Yeah, different than, what you're used to for, No, what I was saying at the last session then, we are, John Hosp and Michelle Hosp and I and some other people are exploring the use of, we're creating some maze measures for high school. And so we hope that that would lead to more use of something like that for screening and progress monitoring. Michelle Hosp works at the Iowa Department of Ed, and she has a colleague there who writes stories. Did I already tell you guys this? Okay, I'm confused now. This is the 3rd session I've done, so I'm confused about what I've told each one. So anyway, if I've already told a story that you've heard today, just go like this. Just go, no more than that. But anyway, she's got a colleague there that's a journalist that writes stories, and he wrote all these stories. And then we did readability levels, and we turned them into maze, and we piloted them, but we haven't tested them yet enough to release them. So I'm hoping that'll be one step. And then I was also mentioning my colleague at Iowa State, Ann Fagan, does work in algebra, and she has algebra progress monitoring measures. Has anybody worked with Ann? She's been here a few times to Indiana, Ann Fagan. Her website is Project AIMS, AAIMS, and she has on her website, if you just Google Project AIMS, AAIMS, she's got some examples of some of her algebra measures. So that is, that's not everything for high school, but that's one of our critical, like, we've got to have early numeracy, number sense at the young grades. We've got to have computation as they move into middle school. We've got to have algebra as they move on throughout high school. Those are like our waypoints. And so her measures are meant to help kids who are either at sort of like that, might be around 8th grade when they have to take, they take Algebra 1 at 8th grade. Or pre-algebra, yeah. And then, or those foundational algebra skills for progressing forward in mathematics in high school. And so hopefully it's hard to, I said earlier, it's hard for us to get the research to keep up with your needs. It's hard, it's needed, and we know it's needed. I had somebody come up at the last session and say, my high school, you can come out and use my high school to do it. I was like, okay, good, because some of it's hard. It's hard to do research in high school sometimes because it's hard to navigate all of the scheduling and the people and the 5 different assistant principals and who do you talk to, and it's not an excuse, but it's sort of a reality. So yeah. Okay, I talked a little bit about that. So let's talk a little bit about, let me see how I'm doing on the questions you asked too. Okay, I'm doing pretty well. Okay, I haven't gotten to the next 2 I want to answer within this. I'm going to talk a little bit about goal setting, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about ways to use your data to make better decisions. So when we have progress monitoring data, there are 3 general ways that we can set goals for that data. We can, and the 3 steps in setting those goals, we have to establish a baseline, set a goal, and then analyze the data. When you set a baseline, the typical method is that you, in screening sense, you would give a student 1 to 3 probes, we call them, and we would take the median of those. Sometimes for some systems, we only give students 1 measure. Like in math, sometimes for screening, you only give students 1 6-minute computation measure or whatever it is. Just be aware, we all know 1 shot, 6 minutes. It takes some of my kids 6 minutes to understand what the directions were. I went in one time, we were practicing our early numeracy measures, and I handed all these measures out to, I think I was in a 1st grade classroom, and I handed all these measures out, and I had them flipped over, and I said the directions. I said, okay, when you start, you're going to circle the number that's bigger, and we practice, up there and practice, and then, and so I said, okay, any questions? Okay, when I say go, you're going to flip your packet, circle the numbers bigger, And so anyway, and it's only 1 minute, so you want them to go, but you don't want to say, go, you want to go, and begin, And so I said, okay, turn your packet over, begin. And they all were like, and I was like, go, go. It took them, we had a few seconds lost. We had a few seconds wasted. We started over actually, because we need them to use that full time. So think about if you have a screening model where students' baseline data is only based on a single measure or single probe. You want to think about giving, to start the goal for that student, you want to think about giving 3 and taking the median or the mean. It's much, we all know that in this room, it's much more stable, okay, much better indicator. And the fear is, and you guys have probably seen this happen too, if you set a goal based on that single data point, the goal might be inaccurate, and then it's sort of like once you start progress monitoring your data, you're like looking at it and you're oh, the student's doing much worse than you would have expected, or in some cases much better, so you want to try to get as accurate as you can with that goal setting. They suggest from the National Center on Intensive Intervention, and I'm not going to be able to quickly articulate the research surrounding this because I don't have it quickly accessible, but they suggest if you collect the data all in one sitting, use the median. If you collect it across sittings, use the mean. Now that's different than I've always suggested, take 3, take the median. They suggest if you do it across days during a week to actually use the mean. And so I'll show you some examples of that as we go. This is just, how to use that median to select. Here's an example of mean. We're not going to talk about that too much. After you have that baseline data, there are 3 ways that we're going to talk about today that you can set a goal. Okay? Most traditional is probably using benchmarks, okay? National norms or benchmarks. However, I want you to be open to thinking about methods beyond just using benchmark, including ROI, rate of improvement, and intra-individual framework, okay? So we're going to talk about all three of those. With respect to your expertise on benchmarking, ROI, and intra-individual framework, how many of you think, raise your hand in a minute, how many of you think you have a pretty good handle on setting a goal using benchmarks? Like norms, okay? How many of you feel like you have a pretty good handle on using rate of improvement to set a goal? Okay? And intra-individual framework? Okay, so that's about what I would expect, but sometimes I have very, very, very sophisticated that are like, oh, intra-individual framework, that's no problem, we've talked about that, I've just been to a workshop on that. So, benchmarks, most streamlined way, if I was just starting with a school, I'd stick with this. We look at benchmarks or norms that have been developed for a particular system. I'd encourage you to use measures that have been validated and have this data to support, that have benchmarks already established. Once in a while I had a school that I worked with in Nebraska for a while, and lovely school psychologists, like wonderful school psychologists, and they were insistent. This was sort of, AIMSweb maybe had just started, DIBELS had been out maybe for a year. They really wanted to create their own measures and norm their own measures. And I tried to talk them out of it, and I said that they should not do that, and they already had kind of started and they wanted to do that. So they were giving all of these measures each year, these sort of like, they were similar looking to some of the other measures, like some passages that the kids read, some nonsense word things. And then the state of Nebraska wanted to give money as like mini grants to pilot sites in Nebraska who were using and implementing good procedures in RTI. And guess what happened? They said, you cannot use your homemade measures unless you validate them, unless you norm them. And so guess what these lovely school psychologists had to do? I didn't help them do the work, but I helped them design it. They had to selectively sample, like stratified, random sampled, gave Woodcock Johnson's to these kids, gave different collected data. We entered all the data. We ran statistical analysis. I mean, I was like, I said again, before we start this, are you sure you don't want to just use DIBELS? Like, it's free. Nebraska likes it, like they'll take you, they'll give you, but they were already passionate and invested in this stuff, and I thought the data from their measures was fine. It was okay, but then a year later, all these districts just started they needed graphing programs and all this stuff, and they moved to like DIBELS or AIMSweb, and it's too bad because it was just a ton of work for these, but I guess sort of, they liked it because it was informative too, but when you pick these benchmark tools, you want to traditionally pick something that's already normed, that already has that data. Basically, these are just some kind of examples of some of those. The National Center on Intensive Interventions can't specify products. They can't support products. And so these were developed using some research that Lynn and Doug Fuchs developed on kind of some open, non-specific passages a while ago in the 90s, and so we just sort of report this as an example. I can talk about products. They just can't talk about products. If my end of year benchmark was, I think in this case, around 40, actually that's not quite, it looks like that's more like 30 or something, right? I just put my X and connect my median baseline or my mean baseline point with my end. That's, the goal is set. For a lot of you, if you're using some type of computerized program, it just sort of automatically does that for you. It's got like a colored bar in, or sort of, does anybody use STAR in here? STAR from Renaissance, yeah. So STAR for screening, they've got, it's a similar thing. They've got sort of a graph that prints out, or it color codes and things like that. That's benchmarking, pretty straightforward. What are the advantages of using benchmarking for goal setting? What are the advantages of that? What do you like about it? Yeah, it's quick. I just pick the value, yeah, put it in. Sometimes it's even done for me, okay? What's another advantage? Solid information, right? Like it's validated information, it's available for me, and it's tracking toward grade level expectations, okay? Sometimes, however, we have students that need alternate goals set for different reasons, and it's many of the students of teachers that you serve in this room, kids that are at risk, kids that are not, that are performing way off grade level, and in that case, we may need to consider alternate ways to set goals for students. Okay. So we're going to talk about the second way, which is setting goals using a weekly rate of improvement, or ROI. The average growth per week can be used to calculate a particular goal. Now, in a minute, we're going to talk about how to calculate an ROI if you do not have one. This was your question. Right now, we're just talking about if you have an ROI that you already know of, a rate of improvement. So on some of your measures now, it gives you the ROI. How do you use that in goal setting? Basically, you take the rate of improvement for a particular measure. So students on average on MComp grow 1 digit per week. I don't know. You know, they've got these calculated. You multiply it times the number of weeks, and you add that to the student's baseline score to get your goal. Now, before all of these great systems, we used to have sort of, I think people call them kind of the Dino rates of improvement. So Stan and some of his colleagues had created tables with moderate and ambitious growth rates. So like, you know, a moderate growth rate in reading might be 1 word per week increase. An ambitious growth rate might be 1.5 words per week. If you, in the absence of anything else, you could still fall back on those. One of the school psychs this morning was asking me if I'm using